Hi, everybody. Welcome to this month's live chat with Lynn. And this month, we're going to discuss the value of lessons, or if there is value in taking lessons. And I wanted to clarify that when we're using that term, or at least when I'm using that term, and Lynn can verify if she agrees or not. Now, when I use the term lesson, that can take a variety of forms. I know nowadays there's a lot of options. There's virtual lessons, there's different clinic formats. There might be, like, if you live somewhere and you don't have access to a trainer specifically, you might have a friend group that offers feedback. I've seen these kinds of situations. So I just want to clarify that we're just speaking to the nature of receiving instruction in a variety of forms. And first of all, I want to make sure, Lynn, is your audio working? It's nice to see you.
You too. Yes, I think so. Can you hear me okay?
Great. We're getting to be such pros at this. And right as I say that,
Yeah.
probably something will happen.
No, don't jinx us. Yeah, and I completely agree with what you're saying about lessons. We need to think outside the box. A lot of people say, well, there's not a trainer near me or an instructor near me, or not one whose attitude toward my horse is something I'm comfortable with. But I've often had a friend come over, my husband, who's he's a capable rider, but not high level, but he's got a good eye. And so if you have a friend with a good eye who can just watch you and report what they're seeing, that can often be helpful. And one of my favorites is video yourself. Every time I video myself or have somebody video me, I look at the video and I go, oh, egads, and I give myself a lesson. Because there's nothing like seeing what you're doing.
Yeah, it's so true. For me, that's one of the values. And I'll clarify that for a moment, because we'll sort of start things off here with, I'll just talk a little bit about my recent trip to Portugal to receive instruction and to train there. But what you're mentioning is a big part of that, Lynn, getting that feedback, because what we feel, and they've actually studied this in the human brain, the area of your brain that can describe a skill or visualize a skill is not always the same part as the one that needs to illuminate for us to perform the skill. So sometimes when we think we're doing something on the horse, it might be a little different than what we're experiencing. We might not be sitting as straight as we think we are. We might not be cueing as the way our body is telling us we are. So that's why feedback can be so valuable. And
yes.
Before we go any further, I did want to let listeners know that, as usual, Lynn has written a little article for us to sort of read and digest after, and we'll post that link in the notes on YouTube when we post this video. And also, it makes reference in the article, but Lynn, one of the chapters in Lynn's book kind of touches on this topic. That's chapter 19, isn't it, Lynn?
Yes.
Okay, and it has tips for becoming the kind of rider that your horse wants to carry. I like how you phrase that, because usually when you read articles in magazines, it's like how to be a good student or how to be the type of student that doesn't annoy your trainer. And I like that you took the horse's point of view. It's like, well, how to be the type of student or type of rider that doesn't annoy your horse, basically. But what was interesting is you make a couple points in the article that speak to the two reasons I think lessons are valuable. First is, in terms of riding and working with horses, I think there is definitely a physical component for the rider. There's a technique to riding or training horses well. There's just the physicality and the precision of what we do. Separate from that, a little bit separate from that, is what I call like training philosophy or horsemanship. It's the knowledge of knowing what to do, what duration to do things for, at what intensity for every individual horse, how to read horses individually. There's all that sort of horse training knowledge. And hopefully when you have a good instructor, you get feedback on both of these. Not always, but sometimes. So the technique of riding a horse is something that, in my opinion, we constantly need help with, for the reasons that we just touched on. Is like our bodies and brains trick us into thinking that we have alignment or we're doing a better job on any given day than we are. But also, if you're doing something that has a lot of components like dressage, and this is why I frequently go places like Portugal to study, the reason I went to the school in Portugal, this time I went to the school of Louis Valença, right outside Lisbon. The reason I go there is they have so many, like more than 20 super highly trained horses. So these are the horses that used to travel on the, well, nowadays the tour is called Cavaluna, but it's kind of the equivalent of the Cavalia show that we had here in the US. It's a totally separate group, but you can think about that level of you know, performance and elegance. That's the level all of these horses are trained to. And so they're all in their teenage years now, and now they give lessons. So where else can you go and have access to 20 or 30 stallions that perform? Every one of them does 110 flying changes and half pass and canter pirouettes. And it gives you a chance to work on technique, right? You're not learning how to train those things on a horse. You're going for the ability to feel, what does that feel like? Because in our world, so often the rider is also being the trainer for their horse. A lot of amateurs are learning how to do the skills themselves. At the same time, they're trying to teach the horse. And it's not always the fairest equation for the horse, because if you're trying to teach your horse shoulder in and you've never felt it, how are you transferring that to the horse? But many of us don't have the luxury to go and ride a really well-trained school horse. So that's one of the reasons over the years I've gone to Portugal. It's, but also to be immersed in that horse culture. I mean, you can see 10-year-old boys riding across the diagonal, doing beautiful flying changes in balance. And you're like, oh, okay, that's humbling. It's wonderful, right? It's totally wonderful. So that's why I seek out these opportunities. I think it's really important. I never want to be what I call master of my own universe and feel like I don't know, reach some level that there's not 100 levels beyond and above. And so that's the technique part of it. And that's what I get from places like Portugal. But then when I work with people here in the US, like my mentor, Dr. Garrett Heuschman, the reason I host clinics with him here in California with me is to get that other part of it, which is how to constantly evolve as a horse trainer, how to read each horse individually, how to adapt what you're doing with each, because they're all so different. What do they need? How to develop each horse physically, because they all have different timelines that they respond to for their physical development, how much pressure to put on or not put on, or some of the things we've talked about in the past, Lynn, is like, am I doing a good job at cultivating a nurturing environment for this horse, one where they can stimulate investigative behavior, those types of things. Sometimes you need a reality check from a coach, I think, because we create our own stories about our horses, maybe what their limitations might be. Or, I mean, I hear students all the time talking about some injury their horse had like 15 years ago, and they're still telling me, well, you know, my horse can't do X, Y, or Z because he had this injury back in the day. And a lot of times it's us holding on to those stories more than the horse sometimes and limiting them. And that's where a coach can say, hey, let's be in the present moment. Let's see where your horse is today, not 15 years ago. That's just one example. But before I go any further, what are some of your thoughts, Lynn? You take lessons, don't you? From time to time?
Whenever I can persuade my instructor to come out here and give me lessons on runs and with my other horses too. So I have both groundwork and or in-hand lessons and riding lessons. Yeah, to me it's exciting because I love to learn. So I always want to be learning something new, but I also feel that I owe it to my horse to make sure that I'm the best, most comfortable, considerate rider I can possibly be, and also to be able to do more interesting things with him. You know, Arabs are notoriously big on being bored and not tolerating that well. But I think most horses appreciate when we have some variety, and it's easy to get stuck in a certain pattern. So anytime you go someplace new, have a new instructor or a new horse to ride, I think it kind of freshens our thinking and it helps us bring more to our rides. And along the lines of instructors, though, you mentioned having somebody who will kind of bring you out of assumptions that you make, but I think there's also a balance of there's instructors who can be very rigid and very, well, you need to do this, and then you need to do this 10 more times. or push a horse beyond what he is physically capable of. So I think we always have to have that balance of being willing and able to say to an instructor, I really don't think my horse is comfortable doing that. He's not ready for it. He's not comfortable emotionally or physically, and have a conversation with them about it. And if you don't feel comfortable having that conversation, you might want a different instructor. So that was just some thought to kind of balance the idea that, yes, we do need fresh eyes, but then we also need to be our horse's advocate if something doesn't feel comfortable.
That's a really good point, and I'm glad you brought that up. And I like when students do take that advocacy and they feel like they can, sometimes I'll want them to do an exercise I know is really valuable, but when they can say, well, I don't think it's appropriate for my horse for the following reasons, or they can be really upfront and say, actually, I don't think I'm comfortable with that exercise. Maybe it involves a small cross rail, or maybe it involves quite a bit of cantering and they're out of shape or whatnot. But then they can ask, is there some way to modify that? Is there something else I can do that's similar that would benefit my horse, but maybe not exactly that? And a lot of times there's definitely ways to modify things and get close to the goal we were after.
Yeah, yes. And as an instructor, I like for students to do that. I want to hear from them what they're comfortable with. I don't want them to just like bite the bullet and do something because I said so. Mm-hmm. That's not helpful for anybody. But anyway, Jack, let's go back to Portugal.
Okay.
And tell us about that.
So the way that it's structured is, and I think this is pretty similar to the European riding schools that people will go to on these riding holidays. The way it's structured is you have 2 riding lessons a day. And, they're pretty physical. They're pretty ambitious. They're about an hour or more, a lot of sitting trot, and a lot of cantering. I mean, these are fit horses. So they really put you to task. And I just love it. It's a chance. I think the real value is it's a chance to be just fully immersed, because you leave your life at home, hopefully, and you're there in this learning environment where you're not having to, do chores and take care of this and that. And you can just really be fully present and take it all in. And it's so incredibly valuable. The instruction is top notch, but the horses are the best instructors. Those horses are amazing. To ride horses that are so highly trained is it's important. And I tell people, any chance you get to ride a really well-schooled and safe horse, do it so you can get those feels. Because sometimes it's hard to imagine what the feel would be, because, like, for example, in modern dressage, sometimes there's a lot of tension that you see, and it's can be powerful and bold and amazing, but it does look like, wow, that half pass looks like you'd have to be some serious athlete. Like, that just looks like a lot of work because the horse is so tense and maybe not correctly balanced. When you have the opportunity to ride these horses that just move like a whisper and experience that lightness on horse after horse after horse, and you go, oh, this is the ideal I'm seeking. That, yeah, it's wonderful to see that and feel that and be part of that. So these are things that I took away from the experience, as well as just that day after day. I was there for 2 weeks. So day after day after day, coaching, a lot of it just picking away at, we all have bad habits, right? Picking away at my bad habits. And when you get them corrected that many times over a 2-week period, it tends to really sink in and you can make some great changes. Yeah, so those are the immediate. And I used to take students to Portugal back in the early 2000s. We would go to a school there, a different school, a little bit further inland in the countryside. It's similar format, 2 lessons a day. It's just wonderful. But it's funny because people sometimes would say, well, what's the value in taking lessons on another horse? Like, what's the point of that? Like, if I'm going to pay for lessons, I want it to be on my own horse. And for me, the values, I think I just spelled them out, is to experience the feel of balance, and because there's so much technique with these exercises that are really beneficial for horses. All the lateral movements, haunches in, shoulder in, renvers, travers, counter, canter. I mean, very few of us have the chance to ride that much balanced counter canter and to understand what is the point of this gymnastic exercise. So to go and experience that on horse after horse after horse, you're not going to be able to do that with your own horse. You'd make them lame, right? But the goal is to be able to do the exercise well enough that you could get your own horse to that point and help them with that exercise. But it's going to help if your body's already, been through the movement several times when you get to that stage. And Portugal is just an awesome place. So
One of the comments that somebody made on my post about lessons was that she'd spent a summer riding other horses in lessons. And when she came back to ride her own horse, she was amazed at how much better her own horse performed with nothing having been done with him over the summer, because obviously her own riding had improved to that point. And you're talking about riding at a level that most of us only dream of. But the same is true for all of us. Any horse you can safely ride with an instructor is going to help you learn something that's going to benefit you when you go back to ride your own horse. When I took lessons with Susan Harris and rode her big boy Max, who's like the opposite of my Bronze. And yet there were things that I learned there that I came home and went, Bronze, let's try it. Oh, and Bronze says, oh, is that what you meant? Why didn't you just say so a long time ago?
Yeah.
So you can get those ahas on lots of different horses.
It's so true. And one of the delightful things for me was that the particular trip I went on was colleagues of mine. I went with my colleague, Patrick King, who many of you might know. And there were two other trainers that joined us on the trip. And it was just really fun and wonderful to hang out with colleagues in such a supportive environment. I mean, we were rooting each other on and having fun and sharing stories and ideas about training, and just delightful to spend time like that with colleagues. But it was also really refreshing to be with colleagues who, taking a lesson, especially in front of people, can feel really vulnerable. I mean, the point, you're not just there to get compliments, hopefully, right? But I think it's a really important part of learning. And I know some trainers who don't take lessons. Well, actually, I know many trainers who don't take lessons for whatever reason. I mean, sometimes it's financial, and that's fair enough. But like I say, I just can't imagine. I can't imagine personally not taking lessons. Now, that doesn't mean I take them like weekly or anything. My schedule just doesn't allow it. But I do make a point every year of planning, like, hey, what are my development opportunities going to be this year, and prioritizing them, because otherwise, like I say, we can actually, I think there was a study on this. I think my student, Kathy Smith, pointed me to some neuroscience, I think, studies on this, where the experts of any field, they proved that over a period of time, because you become so expert at something and you perform that skill or task so long without conscious, deliberate thought, that kind of the wiring can erode a little bit over time. And people who stayed at the highest level of what they do would sometimes try to return to like beginner's mind. They would try to intentionally go back to practicing basics or breaking things down to that deliberate level of, when you're learning something, you have to really think through the steps, and you're like, okay, I'm riding a circle. Okay, so my inside seat bone is here. Am I this? And then that, none of us really think about it, but when you're beginner mind, you do. And so I think it is sometimes really important to unpack things as an expert, because like I say, the expertise can sort of wane over time. And I think that is an aspect of the brain. Now I'm curious to go dig up that study. This was a lot of years ago, or maybe, Lynn, maybe you've heard something similar.
I'm not familiar with that particular one, but I know in general, people tend to, I think that if we don't get any instruction or any feedback, I think our skills tend to get slack or erode, or, we can drift into bad habits. We don't realize it. You have a stiff back one day or a sore leg or something, and then you compensate for it. And then the compensation starts creating other compensations, creates compensations in a horse. And, it's easy, I think, to get on a downhill slide if you don't make an effort to continue to be sharp and improve your skills. Plus, it's fun to learn. It's always exciting to learn something new and then be able to apply that with another horse. And so tell us a little bit more about Portugal. Now, is the horse culture there really different from ours? I mean, I know you were at a real high level place.
It's Well, the culture is different because it is so horse centric. It's a little bit like when you like fly into Lexington, Kentucky, and you get off the airplane and like everything is horse, like all the paintings, like it's just horse everywhere. And you're like, whoa. Portugal as a country is a little bit that way. Like it is such a horse country, and you can't interact with anybody. It seems like a waiter at a restaurant, the bus driver, everybody has some either direct connection with horses, like they themselves ride, or their, brother, sister, and they have such pride in it. Their horses are such a point of pride. They want to tell you about the bloodlines, and their eyes get all twinkly. Some 60-year-old man, he's like all twinkly eyed telling you about his horse's lineage and the training and riding. And so it's really cool. It's very cool to be there. So I think in that sense, it's different. You definitely do see more men, which is cool. Way more men than this country riding and breeding and being involved. So much higher level of participation, I think, for horse activities and dressage. Basically, if you are a serious rider, you're doing some version of dressage. I mean, even the bullfighting is dressage, working equitation, which more people are familiar with in this country now. I mean, that is super high level dressage. We got to have a working equitation lesson on our last day there to sort of put together all these skills, all the dressage that we had done all week in a working equitation pattern. And it's high level dressage, really, at speed. It's very challenging.
Yes, I'm watching some of the higher level riders in working equitation from Portugal. My goodness, that's just amazing.
Yeah.
The skill that requires.
It's so cool. Now, there are things about being there, and I think this is pretty prevalent through Europe when I've been in Germany and other places. The horse keeping is very different. And so we always say before we go, my colleagues and I, like, we can't impose the way we would want to keep horses with how they're kept. So a lot of them are in tiny box stalls. I mean, some of the box stalls are so small they can't even lay down and get back up. They're just solid concrete wall. The land there, there's almost like no land. So these stables, these facilities are sort of, shoved into these tiny little flat areas on hillsides, and they don't have, they're not running in the pasture like they are here. And sometimes, the equipment or the horse's feet is not up to the standard we would want here. And so in some ways, I won't say it's behind us. I would say that they have all the same knowledge. And I think they wish they had access to more land, more available farriers, so they weren't all jockeying to get the same person's attention. And their feed. But this also is why it's so good to travel. It also highlights how adaptable horses are. But because Portugal has also been in a drought similar to California, and because even before the drought, forage was very, very hard to come by. So they are feeding their horses at this school. And I heard reports from other schools, it's kind of similar. They basically take what hay they can get, and it's not high quality. It's probably equivalent of like, teff or very, very low starch hay, and they chop it all up to make sort of a chaff. And then they mix the chaff with like some wheat bran or rice bran or whatever else they have, and they throw in some carrots, and they try to just make as much volume and bulk. The horses are amazing. I mean, I think you saw some of the photos. They are in great flesh and muscle tone. Their energy's off the charts, but they're making do with what they have available. And again, they wish they had access to other things, but it's kind of the nature of weather and development, urban development, and all those things many of us grapple with. So interesting to see that and be reminded there's many, many ways to keep a horse. But what's really cool, Lynn, is I think there were 60 horses on site. And like I say, every last one of them was in a tiny box stall. I mean, some of them look so small. It's like the horse has to bend itself in a pretzel just to rotate this way. And they were all, when you walk down that aisleway, all of them were soft-eyed. Their heads were out, friendly, like, come pet me. There was no vices. Nobody had their ears pinned back. Nobody's cribbing. Nobody's stall weaving. Nobody's kicking the stall door. And
Wow.
I made such an impression on me that I brought it up one night at dinner, and my colleague Megan was like, I noticed the same thing right away. And our other friend Carol was like, yeah, I noticed the same thing right away, because we all think, I mean, but it goes back to, it's the spirit in which you keep horses, I think. For one, these horses receive a ton of exercise. I mean, they come out and work at least twice a day, every day, and they're working hard, and they get a proper cool down and a decent warm up. So their bodies are moving quite a bit. I think that helps. And I think just that it's a testament to, I mentioned these horses are in their teenage years at this point. It's a testament to the training and the care they've had, I think, their whole lives. They're very well adapted, well socialized. They always work in a group. You know, you're always in the arena with 4 or 5 other stallions. They're always together, and they are incredibly healthy, happy horses, even against all odds. You know, it's amazing.
Well, it said it points to the fact that it's not the facilities we have to keep the horses, but rather the way that they're handled, being socialized, having those social times, and having the exercise and the attention, and things that make them feel good physically and emotionally is so much more important, obviously, than what their stall looks like or how much turnout they're getting, even though, you know, naturally we all wish we could have lots of turnout. But and I know I live in an unusually good area for that. We have the land, we have the hay and everything, but is the reality that lots of parts of the world people just don't.
Yep.
And it's so exciting to hear that it's possible to make that a really good life for a horse in spite of those limitations.
Yeah. Yeah, it was pretty cool. Yeah, and I think a lot of it comes back to that interaction with their people, the socialization, all the new exercises and riders they experience. You know, they stay engaged, the horses, they stay, you know, it's not just like going around in circles, giving pony rides day after day. So yeah, it's really neat to see that level of horsemanship. Yeah.
And that points to something that's different, I think, in the lessons that you're describing compared to what I have often seen around my area, where if you take a lesson, it's often an awful lot of going around in circles, trying to get your horse to just carry himself just so. Instead of something that is mentally engaging to the horse, which is a variety of things. And I imagine that makes a huge difference in their fitness, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. These horses, for their age, they are so well developed, and their stamina is just unbelievable. I mean, sometimes when the rider is trying to accomplish something, these horses end up cantering for long periods of time while, you know, I'm fumbling around trying to do the thing, whatever the thing is, and they are not straining, they're not winded, they recover quickly, and the next day they're back at it, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. So it's really cool to see, when the horse is well cared for, how hard they can work and how they can enjoy work, like we've talked about before. I mean, maybe work's the wrong word, but how hard they can engage and not get sour about it. They're not sour at all. None of these horses. There's no teeth grinding. There's no resistance to move forward. They're quite forward. And one of the other aspects of this kind of setup of learning is, I remember interviewing Arthur Cotas this was way back, for an article in Dressage Today magazine when he was the head rider at the Spanish riding school. And he said, the thing about trainers and students is, if I'm going to be an effective instructor for you, you need to trust me. Like, if I tell you to do something, you need to try to do the thing. You need to know that I'm not just like randomly going through a playbook here with your lesson. There's a reason I want you to do this for your horse. Your horse is capable of this. You're capable of this. You know, you need to, because if you always have this little filter that you're taking instruction through, like if your instructor tells you now extend the trot, and you're like, well, maybe I'll just kind of extend it, you know, for whatever reason, you think your horse might spook in the corner, or you're kind of tired that day, whatever. We've all been there. Then you're not receiving the full benefit of the instructor. So it was wonderful to be on horses that these people had trained to the highest level. They know those horses inside and out. They know what those horses can do. So when they tell you to do something, that in my mind, I was like, that's like really hard with me. This horse doesn't know me, right? I'm gonna canter half pass here. I'm gonna make a canter pirouette. I'm gonna canter half pass back to the rail, and then I'm gonna like make some flying changes. And this horse, this horse is not. And it was a great opportunity to not have any of that story in my head. Like if it was my own horse, I'd be like, no way, right? But I know that those people know those horses. They trust them. They know this is reasonable, and they have faith somehow that I'm going to get it done. So I'm going to try to do it. And that's a really positive learning environment to be in when you're not filtering everything your instructor says through your screen, so to speak. I don't know if you've had similar situations yourself.
Well, yes, if you know the instructor knows the horse and you have confidence in the instructor, then you just go for it. I mean, I've had jumping lessons where it's like, okay, go do this, and I'm like, I don't know, but she wouldn't tell me to do it if I couldn't do it, so we do. And it's not the same sense of needing to filter, is this going to be okay for my horse? So that's a benefit certainly of taking lessons where you're on a horse other than your own. I saw somebody pop the question in, are these horses working in the same place every day? Same arena?
In Portugal, so they have two arenas. They have a tiny little indoor arena, and they have a slightly larger, but still not big, covered arena. And then when we're done the lesson, we kind of ride them around the driveway loop. But like I say, it's a very compact little facility. So they mostly are in the arena. But I think I was observing, I think they did intentionally kind of alternate which location, the indoor or the slightly larger one, that the horses were in each day.
So are any of the horses ever expected to be anywhere alone, away from other horses? I mean,
yeah, sometimes
so
they'll do a private lesson, they did that a couple of times throughout our week. If a rider needed more attention, they would do a private lesson. Sometimes when they're just being exercised by the younger trainers, they go out by themselves, and everybody's fine. Nobody's whinnying. It's such a great study in socializing horses, like, Dad, these horses are really well adjusted, and most of them are stallions.
I have a question. This is just my personal particular interest here. Do you have any idea what age those horses are weaned?
That's such a good question.
Probably relevant where you were, but
I don't. I wish I thought to ask that, because we did visit a breeding facility just down the road. It was enormous with these mares. There must have been 50 pregnant mares in this huge field, and they were all about to drop babies. I wish I'd asked. That would be really interesting. You're thinking most are weaned too early in this country. Is that right?
Oh yeah, there's no question about that. And the research is showing that there's a lot of issue that can come up because of the early weaning, because it triggers the separation anxiety that so many people have trouble with in their adult horses. Mm-hmm. So I didn't want to go way off topic here, but it was just something, because you talk about how well adjusted these horses are. And that's pretty significant, because they're not clearly having the kinds of problems that many people report in their own horses in this country.
That's interesting. I'm gonna look into that more.
Yeah, maybe somebody you can ask then.
Yeah.
So from a horse's fitness point of view, what do you see as the benefit of a rider taking lessons, or the dangers of a rider not having regular training or supervision?
There's a lot, because, well, like I already mentioned, sometimes we have tightly held, I do this all the time with my own horse. He had a terrible injury when I first got him as a young horse, and the vets are like, he's never going to ride. And that is always in the back of my head. But that is why it's good for me to take lessons when my mentor comes and he pushes us a little bit, or sometimes gets on and rides Corazon for me. And I was like, wow, Corazon looks amazing. Like, he can do that. Oh, I've been coddling him, which isn't terrible, but that's one of the benefits, is sometimes getting out of your own story. But also from a fitness standpoint, sometimes if you have a favorite batch of exercises and you've been doing them for too long and they're just not serving a purpose anymore, you need a coach sometimes to be like, hey, this isn't appropriate for your horse anymore. Either they're bored stiff or they've developed some compensating movement patterns. They're not even doing the exercises well, or, things like that. Or when horses sometimes age up and start giving you signs that we need to scale some things back, or scale things up. Like that's where I find that an outside resource is so helpful from a fitness standpoint, is like the dosage of exercises. I feel like that's what a lot of students are struggling with. They're like, well, I think this is a good exercise, but how long should I be doing it? Am I doing it too long? Should I still be doing it 3 months from now? And that's where checking in with somebody is so helpful.
Mhm. And in terms of preventing issues with horses too, a lot of riders can develop bad habits. And I know I struggled with bronze for a long time on getting the right lead. We had to really, really work at it. It just never came easy. And I figured out, and he tended to drift right. And I figured out what the problem was when I took a lesson with Wendy Murdoch, and she had me dismount, sit on an exercise ball, and the ball squirted right out from under me and I landed in the dirt. That showed me very clearly what I'm sure Wendy had already seen, that I sat too heavy on my right seat bone.
Yeah.
I'd had lessons from many competent instructors before that, but it was so subtle, nobody could see it. But when I sat on the ball, it became very obvious. And as soon as I understood that, I understood why we had the problem with the right lead. And I also understood why Bronze's chiropractor kept finding that his back was sore on the right side. So simple things that riders might be doing accidentally, and I'm a pretty experienced rider, and you'd think I would know when I was sitting off center, but you don't feel these things. If you drift into them, you don't feel them. And so that of course affected Bronze's fitness hugely, because if his back's sore, then he's got to compensate somehow. And I think that even with a lot of people who feel that they have problems with their horse's behavior, a lot of what's defined as a horse behavior problem is a rider problem.
Yeah.
So we get things like, well, my horse won't stop. Okay, when somebody tells me that, the first thing I look at is, what's the rider doing that's giving the horse confusing signals? Is the rider tipping forward while she's saying stop? Is she squeezing with her legs, gripping with her legs, pushing her heels down, which tightens your calves? There's all sorts of things, and it's amazing how often some simple change in the riding fixes a problem that's really not the horse's problem. So he's getting mixed signals. He has to guess. That's an emotional problem as well as physical. And if he's not comfortable, then he can't do his best work. So these are all reasons it's really important. And I grew up with the phrase, it's never the horse, it's always the rider.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The summer I was 13, my main mount was a blue-eyed black and white pinto named Apache. And I was told before I ever got on him, don't fiddle with your reins. It was a bad habit of mine, or he will buck you off. I think I got bucked off about 10 times that summer, but I learned to keep my hands steady.
Wow.
And in that, nobody suggested that Apache had a bucking problem. I had a rein handling problem. That was really, really clear. And I think the more often we take the view of, it's my responsibility to figure out what I'm doing for better or for worse, and then we can make things much better for our horses, and then make much better progress with them in a lot of ways.
It's so true. I love that. I love that story too. Zoom is telling me it's going to kick us off in less than 1 minute, but that's a great place to finish actually, because I think the learning is never done. And I think that we can know a lot up here, but your point with the ball that Wendy Murdoch put you on is a great example of, it's not that you didn't know you needed to sit equally, but your body was doing something different and you needed somebody to call that out for you and help you so that you could help your horse. And that's what keeps it fun for me anyway. So it keeps it interesting.
I agree.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Lynn, and we'll schedule a talk for next month. So stay tuned on the details, and we'll post the link for Lynn's article and that reference to her book, where you can check it out if you already have it, chapter 19.